All right. Well, welcome everybody. I'm really glad to be here today with my friend Roberto. We've connected many times through text online, mostly on Facebook, but this is our first time face to face. So I'm really glad to have a chat and see what comes out of it. I know he's a really smart guy with a million interesting things to say. So I'm curious what we're gonna get to. But before we start, I thought I'd give you a chance just to introduce yourself, where you're at, and you're in Spain right now, right?
That's right, Seville.
Yeah, yeah. And tell us a bit about yourself. Just introduce yourself so folks know.
Yeah, so by tr profession, I'm a lawyer. And by background, I have a very difficult background to describe in like three or four sentences, but we'll give it a try. Um, I grew up mostly in Mexico on a cattle ranch, and I was homeschooled through the end of high school, and then I went to university and law school in the United States. And um, my family background is very, very conservative, fundamentalist, evangelical Protestant. And so I was raised in the homeschooled evangelical kind of community and ended up coming out of that during university and law school. Now I identify as an atheist, although it's probably a much more nuanced and qualified version of that than you would get from most people who apply that label to themselves. Um, and across the course of my life, obviously that's a pretty radical shift. And so I've worn a lot of religious and metaphysical hats over the course of my life. And so I've tried a lot of different things. Um, One of my favorite things to do, even still today, is going to the local churches, popping in for services, seeing how the services differ from one church to another. I still keep up really ironically, kind of religiously with things like New Testament textual criticism and some other fields of academic research into the phenomenology of religion. Um, and I've had the privilege to live a bunch of different places in my life. As you said, I'm living in Spain right now, but I've lived in Mexico, obviously, also the United States. I've lived briefly in Vienna, Austria, and then also I've lived in Japan and Mongolia.
Oh, wow.
And those were some really interesting opportunities to expose myself to religious traditions that are very much outside of sort of the standard Western milieu. And so when I was in Mongolia, for example, I went to some retreats with some Tibetan Buddhist lamas and practiced meditation with them. Mostly Buddhist. So in Japan, I was working as an English teacher, and Japan is kind of unique in that the Zen tradition in Japan allows its Buddhist monks to get married. And so one of my and they usually don't operate as monks full time. They usually have day jobs and then do temple duties on the weekend or whatever. And so one of my coworkers was a Zen priest, one of these more secular Zen priests. And so I had the opportunity to do sit zazen with him and do some of that as well. Um, and then in addition to that, I've just, I lived in Tucson, Arizona, and there was a Hare Krishna community locally. And so I went to some of their services. As far as Christian exposure, I guess another important thing to mention is as far as my trajectory goes, I started out fundamentalist, evangelical Christian, and then in my early 20s, I ended up switching over to the Eastern Orthodox Church after I got really into Christian history. And I was really, really passionately Orthodox for a number of years and was actually on the priest track.
Nice.
And just before I would have ended up going to seminary, my research into the deeper roots of that tradition and engagement with the scholarship gave me enough doubts that I pulled out at the last second. Um, but probably Orthodoxy is the religious tradition that I know the most about. And although I still identify as atheist today, in terms of how I would sort of perspectivize myself to other people, I would probably say that you could call me post-Orthodox in a lot of ways. A lot of Orthodox thinking has continued to inform the way that I view the world and view the Christian tradition through history. So I guess that's the brief summary. If you have any questions or anything there sounded interesting enough to inquire further, obviously feel free to press.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be curious to hear about your seminary experience. I was a seminarian who dropped out myself. I got a little further than you, but I never was ordained, though I had a church for a couple of years as a student minister. Um, but I also, just the fact that you're an atheist is so fun to me because what the only interactions we've had online are about theology, essentially. We've
Yes.
chatted a little bit here and there about a picture, a meme, whatever, but basically any in-depth conversation we've had has been about theology or philosophy from a religious perspective.
Uh-huh.
You've actually helped me understand a lot of religious language when I'm reading the church fathers and stuff like that in some of our dialogues. So I just find that a really interesting dynamic, and I'm curious why you chose that dynamic. How like why go that path? Why be online debating theology with people when you're an atheist? Not that I'm
Well,
saying it's
yeah,
wrong. I'm glad you do, but
yeah. So
yeah,
the reason though the way that I came out of um the way that I came out of the fundamentalist Christianity that I was raised in was mostly that uh, my mom is a journalist and by trade, and one of the things that she really drilled into me was having a very strong regard for trying to look for the truth. Although, of course, that's can be very complicated. What is truth? Kind of.
quote Jesus himself. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, actually, I think it was Pilate who said that. What is
Oh
truth?
no, isn't it
Um,
Jesus? Jesus says.
uh,
Pilate says, "Are these things true?" And he says,
it could be.
"Yeah,
I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't have the memory
yeah,
quite on that. But yeah. And so another really important aspect of journalism is that whether or not you conclude that somebody is credible on a particular perspective, it's really important to report what they say in their own words, to give them their own voice in the story, even if you provide a commentary on top of that or an evaluation or analysis that goes on top of it. And so my approach to, learning things about stuff that doesn't agree with me or comes from a different tradition or whatever has always been very much to try to put myself in the shoes of someone who's there and ask what their story is from their perspective. And I think that that's a very important part of, I've done a lot of, as a lawyer, obviously, I've done a lot of debating as well. And in terms of debate, if you want to make a good argument with somebody who disagrees with you, it's very difficult to do that if you don't start from a position of trying to argue from their point of view. And a lot of people will in the online kind of debating community will call this steel manning a position, which as opposed to straw man.
oh,
And
okay,
so and so a straw man is when you take somebody else's position and you turn it into a distorted version of it in order to be able to beat it up very easily.
yeah."
Um,
Richard
and
Dawkins taking out the fundamentalist, flat Earth creationists and whatever. That's
yeah, exactly.
yeah,
I'm sure that Richard Dawkins is steel manning some people because any perspective you can generally find at least somebody who believes it, even if it's super wild from an ordinary point of view. But yeah, so steel manning a position is making the position the strongest possible version that it can be articulated before you start offering critique. And so the idea is, even assuming that everything that you say is true, I disagree because such and such and such. And so it's a principle of interpretative charity that you give to the person that you're talking with. And so I think it's just a decent thing to do. And I also think it's a very important way to critique ideas, because if you're not critiquing the idea at the source, then you're critiquing a version of the idea, a perspective on the idea, rather than the fundamental idea itself. And so when it comes to, for example, Christianity, I think it's very important to talk to Christians as though I were a Christian myself. And having been a Christian myself, I'm able to put myself in that frame of mind very easily and assume that the things that they think are in fact true and offer a critique from that perspective. And I think it's very difficult to do a fruitful dialogue with somebody if you don't have at least some version of that going on within the discourse.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I mean, jumping from there, our topic today that we had said we would just loosely discuss is mysticism, is a a very
Yeah.
narrow, specific topic like mysticism. Um, and I mean, I'm curious what that means to you as an atheist. What is Are you do you practice a form of mysticism? Do you just study it? Like, what does that look like? Is
Yeah,
it more of a
sure.
Buddhist kind of thing?
So, my interest in mysticism comes from my background because if you're an evangelical Protestant, there isn't really much emphasis on mysticism in the tradition. Like there's sort of an impoverished version of it in the sense that like you're still supposed to pray, you're still supposed to try to listen for, the Spirit of God moving your heart to do things or whatever. There's even sort of like pseudo divinatory practices where, you'll open the Bible and put your finger on a particular verse, and that's supposed to be God telling you something relevant to the question that's in your mind. Um, but relative to most other world traditions, the mystical tradition in fundamentalist evangelical Protestantism is very impoverished. And so it didn't take me very long as an adult to discover just how much experience I was kind of missing out on, even within just the Christian tradition. And so when I became Orthodox, of course, Orthodoxy is very much categorically the other end of the spectrum. Like Orthodoxy is almost mystical to a fault. Everything is about doing rituals and saying mantras and having private devotions to particular saints or events or what have you, keeping a liturgical calendar, um, emphasizing the importance of physicality in terms of crossing yourself and doing prostrations and fasting and all these other sorts of things. And all of these are supposed to have direct benefits to your spiritual life. And so I threw myself into the mysticism of Orthodoxy, and I really got a lot out of it. I discovered that it was a much richer way to engage in that tradition than trying to approach it from just a purely intellectual level. That a lot of the things that you read in the Bible and Christian history and so on come alive a lot more if you are engaging in these sorts of mystical practices. And I also had, while I was in the process of converting to Orthodoxy, I had some profound mystical experiences that, from my Protestant perspective, were very difficult for me to explain or place in a coherent framework. And so that also motivated me to do more research into it. And we can talk more about that after I lay out the framework, if you like. I'm happy to share as far as I can, as far as you can put it into words, some of the experiences that I've had. And so, as I was deconverting from Orthodoxy, I became aware that there's a fair amount of research into mysticism from the academic side, which tries to articulate both in terms of phenomenology and also in terms of like neurology, like what is a mystical experience? What is it doing to your body? What is it doing to your mind? So on. And so that interested me very much. And it became fairly obvious to me that there are a lot of like in general, things exist for a reason, whether it's a good reason or a bad reason. And so mystical traditions do actually have very important social and personal benefits in many cases, although, of course, they also come with dangers on the other side. And that's also something that Orthodoxy leans into very much is that there are better and worse ways to do mysticism, and there are definitely cautions with mysticism to avoid developing too much of an ego about the practices that you do to, set yourself over other people. There's definitely ways that you can evaluate the product of your mystical practice to see if it's being efficacious in a meaningful way. And so, in addition, as I was coming out of Orthodoxy, I became aware that there are other ways to approach mysticism from like, the Hare Krishnas and so on. But also from a more secular perspective, um, there's, for example, there's been a lot of work done in the intersection of mystical experiences and, for example, psychedelic drugs. And so I was fortunate enough to have some friends who had done some of that and were interested in sharing that with me. And so in part of my deconversion process, I also experimented with, marijuana and LSD and psilocybin mushrooms and what's the one that's like a like a fern? I'm blanking on the name right now. Salvia
Oh,
divinorum.
salvia divinorum.
Yeah.
I used to eat acid and then smoke salvia when I was peaking. I'm
Oh,
revealing my thing here, but like it just met. I lived 50 years in 10 minutes one time.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, salvia and then like ketamine as
Yeah,
well,
I did a
stuff
lot
like
of that
that.
too. I'll tell you my
Yeah.
story, but I've done all that stuff.
Yeah.
I sold all
And
that.
so
Yeah.
and so that made me realize that there's a very direct physical neurological component to mysticism, right? It's not just the spirit reaching out from the ether to move your soul in some particular way. You can change your neurochemistry and have a very profound mystical experience, and there are ways that you can direct that in predictable sorts of ways. And so, of course, that was also very interesting to me, especially doing acid and mushrooms in particular really expanded my idea of the perspectives that you can take on the material world. It really made me realize that, what you see, what you feel, what you taste, what you think about are all very much physical structures that are being reflected back into your consciousness in some way, and that alterations to those structures can completely change what seems to be real to you. Almost, and that also kind of intersects in many ways with research into mental health, like with schizophrenia and so on. And so uh, that convinced me pretty well that there were probably important secular applications to mysticism. And on the other hand, as I was coming out of Orthodoxy and getting involved in the atheist community, it was extremely popular at the time. This was about what, 2010, roughly. At the time, the new atheist movement was very popular online and was getting a lot of press. And I, with the exception of Sam Harris, who has kind of leaned into this as well a little bit, pretty much all of the loud and prominent atheists in the atheist community, like Dawkins and Hitchens and so on, were very much, from my perspective, reflecting that kind of impoverished attitude toward mysticism that I had experienced growing up in the fundamentalist community. And so, and that rubbed me the wrong way. It seemed to me like a mistake for two reasons. The first being that just objectively, there seem to be natural or naturalistic avenues from which you can look at mysticism as something that's potentially, an interesting human activity, something to do, something to explore. And then just on a more social level, it seemed to me that there was way too much emphasis within the atheist community on the like facticity of claims that were being made by religious people, and there was almost no attention being paid to the social role that religion plays in human community. And my experience was very much that religion is much more about the social elements than it is about the actual fact claims. Most people who are, fundamentalist Christian or whatever, they might believe that Jesus rose from the dead, but they haven't investigated that claim. They don't have like a model of how that would have worked metaphysically. That's all completely irrelevant to that. 99% of what they go to church for is because it gives them a community, it gives them a sense of belonging. When they pray, they feel uplifted past their ordinary cares and troubles in the world. They feel like they have a sense of social and perhaps metaphysical guidance from participating in these common community rituals. And so it seemed to me that the new atheist movement, and I feel like history has borne me out very well on this. It seemed to me that the new atheist movement was destined to basically run itself aground in the long term because you could convince people that the specific fact claims were wrong, but if you didn't leave people with a sense of what now,
It's
a
an
sense of
entirely negative philosophy. It's just an attack
exactly.
on someone else. It provides nothing in terms of anything.
Exactly.
It's just
There
a
was it was
deconstruction.
basically it was basically a now you're free, figure it out for yourself, which works for some people, but most people are looking for something that can replace that community, that, you know, embodied guidance sort of sense, that coming together for something greater that religion is really, 80 to 90% about. And so it seemed to me that the new atheist community was going to just kind of implode in the long term, and that a lot of the people in the new atheist community were either going to be distancing themselves explicitly from atheism over the longer term, or they were going to continue to be atheists, but they were going to fill that void left behind by religious community with something else that hadn't been carefully considered. And I was,
Cosplay. I straight up think cosplay and furries and like all of that kind of like things that are growing and these kind of
yes.
secular things. They're totally religious expressions because people have lost church. That's my
But I
biggest
also
thought now.
think
And
that
fandoms, like
things
people
like
who are hardcore into Star Trek or whatever, and they'll start to develop spiritualities. I'm not against it, but it's
yeah,
human nature, right? And we start to have
I
religious
also think though
experiences
that
around
like
it.
a lot of the rise of the radical right and like QAnon and the rise of conspiracism and so on is coming from those sectors where people who have become disillusioned for whatever valid reason with traditional religiosity, a lot of the times will divert a lot of that energy into something that is quite toxic, into believing that, Kennedy's still alive and, Trump is, about to I was on an airplane one time and the guy sitting next to me immediately started in on how Trump was going to be arresting all of the pedophiles and there was going to be this like military strike on all these super powerful people and all these people were going to get dragged out in the open and executed in public and just all this wild stuff. And it was clear that he had a community that believed this with him, and that their participation in that delusion was a super important part of his identity, in the same way that religion is a super important part of identity for a lot of other people.
Mhm.
And so from the very beginning, I saw that there was a big risk of this void being filled by bad actors. And even if not bad actors, just by stuff that hadn't been considered, that hadn't been applied in a reasoned way to the religious experiences that people have. And so that all made me feel like there's a very important gap here where people who have deconstructed their religion, who have come to view a lot of these fact claims of religion as false, need to be providing a path to an alternative way to look at community and an alternative way to look at those experiences that people have had, to bring them together around more constructive principles. And I feel like mysticism has a lot of secular potential in that regard, to expand our view of who we should extend empathy to expand our view of community, to, for example, honestly, it's not in an organized sense, but I was very influenced early on in my deconstruction by Carl Sagan's Cosmos. And he definitely takes pains to, poke holes in a lot of traditional religious claims as he's describing all this scientific material. But he also has a profoundly poetic and I would say mystical view of the importance that these things can play in the way that they reconstruct our view of the universe. In particular, I bring to mind a lot his idea of the pale blue dot, if you're familiar with that. He there was a probe that was sent out from, I think that might have been one of the Voyagers, that was sent out from Earth and took a bunch of pictures. And Sagan specifically asked that there be one picture taken that was at the apex of its journey, looking back toward Earth. And it took this very famous picture called the pale blue dot, which is this vast star field, and there's just this little tiny bright dot in all this solar radiation just shining out, and that's Earth. And he has a very famous monologue about that, where he almost a soliloquy, where he says, every love, every fear, every hope, every king, every nation, everything that you have ever heard of or conceived or ever will be is on that dot, on that mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. That's us. And looking at things from that distance perspective, you see how much we share and how absurd a lot of these ideas and these grandiosities that we experience seem from that kind of remove. And so I think that mysticism plays a very important role in letting us adopt perspectives like that and keeping our, for lack of a more secular term, keeping our souls healthy in our exploration of the world around us.
Yeah, yeah, that's cool. It sounds like you're describing a lot of sort of cognitive exercises and stuff like that. It makes me think of John Vervaeke. I don't know if you've
Yeah,
delved into his work or
yeah,
not. I watched Awakening from the Meaning Crisis like 3 times. I don't agree with him on everything, but it was super helpful just like
yeah,
to have the whole big picture of it. And a lot of what you're talking about there makes me think of some of his dynamics around spiritual practices and how he takes apart the Stoic practices, kind of like what you're describing
yes.
there of the
Hmm.
view from above, and talks about the way that it expands our cognitive scope, which then allows us to perceive more options, which then allows us
Hmm.
to expand our scope again. And that there's this sort of reciprocal process that continues to open, reciprocal opening, he calls it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other really important aspect of this is I also am reasonably into psychology. And one of course, the great advance in psychology as a discipline is not that old, but probably the greatest advance in psychology since its inception has been the notion of the unconscious and how what we perceive in a direct discursive kind of way is just the very, very tippy top of what's actually going on, what's actually being processed under the hood.
Mhm.
And in particular, in addition to the stuff about, expanding our scope, expanding our compassion, and so on, one thing that I think is super important in mysticism is that mysticism uses symbolic experiences and language to draw out what is happening in that unconscious area. And you can't, to not to be too Lacanian here, but like you can't look at it directly in a discursive way. There isn't language to describe it in a discursive way, but you can
Otherwise,
bring
it wouldn't
the
be subconscious.
exactly. But you can bring it out in symbolic forms, which can be approached and dissected and examined in a symbolic, in a discursive kind of way. And that gives us a tremendous amount of insight into ourselves and better understanding of ourselves. And I think not to be too mystical here, but I think that there's a lot of evidence. For example, if you look into research on intuition, there's some research that suggests that our intuitive takes on particular tasks, if you're presented with a task and before you can reason through it, you're demanded to give a particular answer. Our intuition is actually very good at doing that processing faster than our conscious minds can do it. I believe that the statistic that I read, and obviously you want to check this, but I believe it was somewhere in the order of 70% of your intuitive responses trend toward being correct. And that suggests to me that there's a very powerful processing function in the unconscious that is important to leverage. And so, for example, you were asking kind of before about like, what sort of mystical practices I do today. And so, I'll do stuff that is very sort of cognitively focused, like meditation. Um, like I said, I'll also attend religious services. But one of the things that I do fairly frequently that has been super helpful for me personally has been it's not exactly tarot reading. It's a slightly different system, but it's basically tarot reading. And a lot of people who know I'm an atheist that just drop their jaws when they see me pull out a deck of cards and go, "Would you like me to do a reading for you?" Because it's very against the idea that there isn't anything spooky happening, right? And so, to be clear, I don't necessarily think that there is anything spooky happening when I'm doing a tarot reading, but it is giving you access to that symbolic element of yourself. And I guess sort of a meditative practice, if you want to look at it that way, I found that it has given me profound insight into me and my motivations, and even almost in a predictive sense into like how things are going to operate in the future. It's a very powerful way of reframing your experiences in ways that your discursive mind wouldn't be able to accomplish in a million years. And so whenever I'm feeling lost or stuck or, anxious about something or whatever, I can whip out the deck of cards, pull a few cards out and go, all right, what are these cards saying? And of course, the cards aren't saying anything. It's me talking to myself, but it's me talking to myself through that symbolic filter that gives me access to the complete consciousness rather than just the discursive part. And I found that to be super, super powerful as far as helping me reduce my anxiety about things, helping me see alternative possibilities, giving me insight into attachments that I have that I didn't realize I had. It's a tremendously powerful tool for expanding your perspective and expanding, like you were saying with the Stoic thing, expanding your view of the options available.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that the one thing where I'm not super sure about is how to implement this in a way that goes beyond individual practice. I've obviously spent a lot of time on individual practice, and I feel like I can articulate pretty coherently the benefits and sort of the theory of how to approach individual practice from a secular level. The part that I keep getting stuck on is how do you expand that in terms of scope from an individual level to a group level without ending up in something that is basically just another form of religion, which ends up becoming dogmatic about stuff and becomes fixed in its ideas and practice. I haven't solved that. If I do, I'll let you know.
Yeah, I'm not sure how you can have a tradition without having a tradition.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
you might have to bite the bullet and just have a tradition of some kind, um,
Yeah.
which I think is really true. And I think that's one of in our postmodern world the destruction of tradition and the sort of rejection of tradition as something both within religious, because I talk to so many deconstructing evangelicals and stuff, and then the
Sure.
people
Yeah.
who attack me online all the time because I'm like one of the worst heretics, and I don't
Of
try
course.
and hide it or anything like that or try and humor them. Um, I can't remember what I was even saying now. I got distracted by that. What was
How
I
about
saying?
how to have a tradition without having a tradition?
Yeah, yeah, how to have a tradition without having a tradition. And I think in the postmodern world we've lost that sense of tradition. You see a lot of Protestant traditions, ironically
Mhm.
using the word tradition as a pejorative. Like, oh, that's the
Yeah.
traditions of man. It's not the scriptures and that kind of thing. And then you also have the atheist sort of idea that like rituals and traditions, unless it's just like a birthday party song or a Christmas tree or something,
Yeah.
it has no real value, and it's actually detrimental in a lot of people's minds anyway. But I think it's so important that we have tradition because we it's that perspective piece, and it's that cultural
Mhm.
perspective piece, because there's the individual opening of our expansive thing, but like you were saying, how do we do it as a group? And I think tradition is how we do that, because you are forced, if you're going to engage with the tradition, as you know, if you're going to engage with the tradition
Yeah.
in any kind of real way, you are forced out of your cultural mindset, your secular, colloquial, whatever language you speak, whatever culture
Yeah.
you live in, you have to leave that behind to go read the Bible, because it's written in a whole different thing that doesn't make any sense to us. And you have to
Yeah.
learn a different way of seeing the world, a different cosmology, a different all of that. And I could see that even if the cosmology is wrong, that learning it
Yes.
is a cognitively beneficial process,
Yeah, it
despite
provides a
despite the fact that the cosmology might, there may be some misinformation there. But
yeah, it provides a dialectical ground from which you can proceed, even if the way that you proceed is in kind of destroying the dialectical ground behind you to some extent. I think that I'm a fairly big proponent of reading more Nietzsche. And I think that Nietzsche is a pretty good example of how you can draw on the idea of traditions in a way that is innovative rather than slavish. If you read Nietzsche, most of his critique of Christianity is framed around the the oppositions of other elements in the classical sort of lineup. Of course, Nietzsche famously, in his madness, started referring to himself as Dionysus, and and he very frequently contrasts the Judeo-Christian kind of frame with the Greek frame. And likewise, of course, perhaps his most famous work is Thus Spake Zarathustra, which is entirely an epic poem, which is very much grounded in the symbolism of ancient Persia. And so I feel like that provides, it provides something where when you are reading Nietzsche and he says Dionysus, he doesn't mean Dionysus the way that the ancient Greeks meant Dionysus, but there is still an inextricable connection between Nietzsche's use of that word and the ancient Greek sense of that word. And it's our familiarity with what that meant in the ancient Greek context that gives us enough starting ground to then appreciate the way that Nietzsche is transforming that concept and opposing it to other things that he's dialoguing about. So I definitely agree with you that in some sense tradition is inescapable, and it's indeed we should probably lean into the profitable elements of the framework that tradition provides. It's just very important to keep in mind, and here I get kind of more Lacanian. It's very important to keep in mind that whenever you're engaging with the tradition, it is still a construct. It's not a thing in itself. And so as long as you appreciate that it's a thing in itself and that has a plasticity that you can play with and adapt and transfigure, then that's how you avoid getting caught in the gravity well that tradition provides in so many cases, I think.
yeah, and it's interesting because there's different, like my background, I haven't done that part yet. I'll give you a little bit of that because my traditions are very different
Mhm.
and have their own shortcomings and solutions to your problems, which end up having their own problems.
Yeah.
Um, so I grew up a mixture of Quaker,
Oh,
liberal,
nice.
unprogrammed friends in a rural meeting with gray walls. I grew up on a farm. We had a car and a TV, but I had friends with horses and buggies. So I grew
Hmm.
up like old school in the country, but also a hippie. So we were on a rhea farm, which are like smaller ostriches.
Oh,
Um,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
and so we had an organic farm and we were hippies, and I was also like a neo-pagan, and my first experience as a religious leader was as a kid leading astral projection Wiccan circles with my
Oh,
Quaker
nice.
Sunday school buddies, first day school friends. And my mom also brought me to indigenous ceremony a lot, so like I went to my first
Yeah.
when I was 12. And I throughout my entire 20s I was like deep into ceremony. So I was out in the bush way up north, learning from elders who spoke Nishnabewin as their first language, people who like a living tradition of it.
Yeah.
And to have that living mystical tradition, ascetic tradition, which people don't associate with it, but deeply ascetic. I've got scars and I
Yeah.
fasted for days at a time, like it's a hugely ascetic tradition.
Yeah.
And I actually talked more in detail about that the other day with somebody, which I'll put out soon. But yeah, in both of those traditions, in the Quaker and in the Ojibwe, the Anishinaabe tradition, you have a more fluid notion of it. So I think, like in Christianity, we think of tradition as something like that you can't break, right?
Right. Something magisterial.
Yeah, something that is handed down perfect, that your responsibility is not to create or to contribute to, It is to preserve and perhaps to highlight and to
Hmm.
maybe to flesh out whatever, but like you've already been given it, right? You've
Right.
already received it. Whereas the Quaker tradition is the exact opposite. We believe that God leads us through the individual soul, but primarily through communities receiving that information together in silence. And so I spent a lot of time in silence as a kid.
Yeah.
And then we move forward, and so the tradition grows and changes. And so Quakerism doesn't have any dogmas or doctrines, they say. I mean, it's, you equivocate,
Hmm.
we have testimonies instead. But they are very loose, and they're all about, just nonviolence and simplicity and these kind of sort of
Yeah.
like lifestyle choices. There's no doctrinal requirements of any kind. Lots of my Quaker friends are atheists too. Um, and so I've seen, on the one hand, the beauty of that, growing up in that, and what it's allowed me to do as an adult. I see people who grew up in fundamentalist, really closed off traditions, and how much work it is just to learn from another tradition, and how
Yeah.
long it takes just to open your mind to what a Hindu might have to say or something like that. Whereas I
Yeah.
was grew up with like, everybody knows the truth. That's how Quakers believe it. Um, but yet at the same time, it also is a tradition that is dying, at least in Canada. I don't know how it's doing in Africa. They've got a whole lot of Quakers that are different from Canadian Quakers in Kenya and Uganda and stuff. But the Canadian Quakers, like I grew up, I went to all the Quaker youth groups and Quaker summer camp and all that. My best friends are all Quakers. And they'll call them, they're like, basically most of them are like cultural Quakers, I guess you would say. They wouldn't
Yeah.
say it that way, but like they're Quaker because that's the community, because we're a tight knit community that knows each other really, really well. And we have some shared common practices and some shared beliefs.
Mhm.
But they don't live a life different than anyone else or go to meeting or study anything spiritual, and they're atheists, which is all fine and good, but they've essentially lost the tradition, and all of their kids won't
Yeah.
necessarily, right? Like, and it's just going to fade that way over time. And so that's the downside I've seen to it. An open tradition is that on the one hand, it allows it to grow and change and adapt to the needs of the time, which is important and good. And that's the beauty it brings. But that comes with a risk, because there is
Yeah.
security in maintaining what, not just what was handed to you, but what was handed to you from generation to generation to generation, because
Mhm.
that means it's withstood the test of the limited perspectives. It's been useful in multiple,
Yeah.
multiple, multiple contexts, and therefore it's more likely, not guaranteed, obviously, but more likely to have value to someone. And a lot of that gets lost in a more open tradition. In the Ojibwe side, though, it's not like that. And I'm trying to think of why, like what the difference is, because it's a very much also an open tradition. I had a doctoring the other day. I've got a lot of pinched nerves in my back, and I had a medicine man, Madeo, an elder, come that I know from ceremony, and he did a doctoring on me. But like he was talking about Metatron, and he was like all this different stuff, right? Like
Yeah.
they'll commune with any spirit that talks to them. There's no sense of like you have to maintain this tradition. If you're following the tradition,
Yeah.
it's the rituals, it's the songs, it's the stories. It's
Yeah.
not like something that you are allegianced to. It's just a culture, and not
Well,
just a culture, but
I think that points to the essential difference, is that if you want to be really kind of brute about it, the issue with Quakerism as an open tradition is that it hasn't built a lot of cathedrals, so to speak. And when you have a cathedral, even if, like here, I live here in Seville, it's a city of churches, there, I literally live in the old 1625 monastery of the Discount Trinitarians. And right across the wall from here is the oldest image of Christ in the city that gets paraded around in the Holy Week every year. And so having that, well, to sort of say it very broadly, having that cultural, but I would kind of narrow it even a little more and say having that sort of aesthetic uh, fixity comparatively, I think is what helps keep a lot of that alive. There's a lot of people who are culturally Catholic here, but the churches are all crowded every Holy Week, and people care about maintaining them, and they're a source of great pride for the city. They're a source of identity for the people who live in the city. Um, Tons of people who are out and out atheists are members of the sacred brotherhoods here in Seville, and they come and they turn out every festival day in their capes and hoods and crosses and everything, and march together with the people who are true believers. And that that continuity is really buoyed and maintained for the most part by the commitment to the aesthetics, by, like I said, by the fact that there is a cathedral. There's a cathedral there. You grow up, you're looking at the cathedral every day, and when it comes time to be an adult and make your own choices, you might not agree doctrinally with any of the things that the institution preaches officially, but you would still be really sad to see that cathedral come down. And you would really be really sad to see nobody left to march in Holy Week. And so there's a lot of people who say, I don't believe it, but these are important things. These are important symbols that I grew up with. And it's very important to me to keep these things going. And I obviously it's a very different context for like native spirituality. But I feel like a lot of the connections are very similar, in a lot of like I lived for a while, 3 years-ish on Navajo Nation, and which is of course the largest Indian reservation in the United States. And so the Navajo very much have that kind of approach that you were talking about with the elder, where there's a lot of Navajo who go to church every Sunday, but also go to sweat lodges and do peyote and sing and dance and so on, and see absolutely no conflict between those things. And so it's much less about the actual belief. The tradition is quite open, but it is very deeply important to them as markers of identity, as markers of culture, that they know some of the language, that they participate in some of the old ceremonies that their grandfathers taught them. And not that there isn't a significant amount of decay there just from modernity, regardless. I dated a Navajo girl on the reservation, and she mentioned to me once that her grandfather was a stargazer, and he would look at basically an astrologer for the Navajo, and that he was one of the last stargazers of the Navajo. That knowledge has basically died out completely in the current generation. And so not all of the traditions get carried forward. The more complex ones, the ones that require more commitment on a day-to-day basis are very much under strain in the modern context, especially given the socioeconomic conditions that prevail in Navajo Nation, which make it very difficult for people to have the leisure time and the margin to go pursue some of these older ways. But the older ways are valued very much, not necessarily for any kind of dogmatic reason, but for aesthetic reasons, for reasons of cultural identity. And I feel like that's always, from the looking from the outside in, I feel like that's always something that the Quakers have kind of struggled with, is they're not it's not a community that has committed a whole lot to developing a unique system of art or architecture
We've
or a special
actually,
language.
yeah, we've actually intentionally not done that. So the Quaker
Yeah,
tradition, the society, is founded on the principle that rituals and are like doctrines in that they're methods that the church controls people. And so it emerged out of the
yeah,
17th century mentality
yeah,
of rebelling against the institutional church. And so the first Quakers
yeah.
didn't sing because the hymns weren't scripture and they were the church telling you what to believe. And they didn't do
Hmm.
rituals because it was the church trying to control you.
Yeah.
And they just sat in pure silence and opened their hearts to the divine light, and that's all there was to it. And there's a beautiful sentiment to that.
Hmm.
But in practicality, growing up in it, I've noticed on the one hand it leads to an egoism because it means that we have the one true pure light and everybody else is wasting their time with all their
Yeah,
ritualistic nonsense. And I
yeah.
I heard growing up a lot of gossip about the Anglicans and their stupid communion meals, right? And how they actually believe that the bread was Jesus. Like, how do they think they are? Why don't
Hmm.
they just sit in silence and listen? you know,
Yeah.
and so there's that. And then on the other hand, growing up in both the Quaker and the Ojibwe, were generally indigenous. When I was younger, it was more Algonquin, but
Hmm.
uh, that's a highly ritualized tradition.
Yeah,
And it's
there's
funny.
songs that have gone on for years. There are dances that have been
Yeah,
known for generations.
yeah. I have fasted on Thunder Mountain where people have been fasting for no one knows how long, like just forever.
Hmm.
There's no written record of it that a historian could say. It's just been passed down from time immemorial that we go to
Yeah,
this rock to fast, and that's where I fast, and that's where I gave my life to that rock, that mountain.
yeah.
It's alive.
And Orthodoxy very much has done the same thing. Like if I were to guess, I would guess that probably 90 to 95% of people who are baptized Orthodox today are not dogmatically Orthodox in any meaningful sense. You know, most of the Greeks who show up to church on Pascha couldn't tell you five doctrinal things about Orthodoxy. Um, in same with the Russians, Russia, despite leaning really hard into Orthodoxy since the end of the Soviet era, um, is one of the most secular and least religiously inclined societies on earth. Um, but during, especially for the Greek and Arab traditions of Orthodoxy. That was how they maintained a cultural identity during 400 years plus 450 years of Ottoman occupation. And so the way that you marked yourself as being a Greek or, a particular kind of Arab or what have you, is that you would consciously adopt the symbols and the trappings and the practices of the Orthodoxy. And in fact, to the point where there was almost a Caesaropapism. Well, Orthodoxy's always struggled with Caesaropapism, but in the Ottoman context, it's quite interesting because the head of the Greek Orthodox Church, the ecumenical patriarch, was actually ethnarch of the Greeks under the Ottomans. And so he had a political office that had a tremendous amount of power over the Orthodox Christian community and directly administered a lot of very secular bureaucratic sort of things within the Ottoman Empire. And that division was made very much on the basis of religious hierarchy and religious authority. And so that has led to the conservation of orthodoxy very much as a tradition within those peoples, despite the fact that today all the Greeks are super secular and they don't really give a crap about I mean, they're a little more conservative than like the median European, I would say, but it's definitely not something that they take seriously in a dogmatic sense for the most part.
Yeah, and I think beliefs are important. And I do my best to have good ones and to test them and to change them. But ultimately, they're not the most important. The line I always say to people is that for me, theology is always done in service of contemplation. That for me, the practice of theology is a step in the contemplative mystical journey.
Yeah,
The
and that's actually a very orthodox
oh, it
attitude.
is, yeah, of course, the
Yeah,
theoria physica.
yeah, exactly. The,
Yeah,
the the Orthodox attitude is very much that theology is mysticism. That
yeah,
theology, that to the extent that theology is something that you would discuss in words in an academic paper or whatever, it ought to be very much downstream from your practice as somebody who prays and goes to the rituals and does all these other things, because how could you possibly speak of these deep mysteries if you had not experienced them? You know, if you're just describing it from the outside, it's sort of the if you know do you know what a philosophical zombie is?
no,
So there's a thought experiment in terms of like how do you determine what consciousness is, right? The hard problem of consciousness.
mhm,
And so the idea is that imagine that there were a philosophical zombie. Imagine that there's a zombie that doesn't have any consciousness, but he has all the programming, all the strings inside that make him operate just like a regular human being, right? So he comes up to you and he can talk and interact. And if you ask him a question, he can spit out an answer, but nothing inside is going on. He doesn't have any first person experience as such, right? And so the idea is how would you tell that somebody's conscious or not if the if a philosophical zombie is possible, right? And so it brings to mind this idea that everything that we think that we know about consciousness is something other than our own first person experience. Ultimately has to be inferential, right? We're seeing a behavior and we're saying, oh, well, I do something like that. Therefore, that's probably conscious, right? And obviously, it's not that is doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Well, depending on what perspective you take metaphysically on there's some people who argue that that the idea of philosophical zombie isn't coherent. But
It's
if
offhand, but
yeah, but accepting the basic thought
sure,
experiment,
yeah,
everything that you see in something else is inferential. And so orthodoxy sort of takes this same approach of if you're looking at something from the outside, all you can do is describe it. You're not actually speaking from the experience of it. And there are very important features of a being which can only be described from an experiential perspective. You know, if you ask somebody, to get sort of romantic for a second, if you ask somebody like, what is love, right? It's possible to articulate love in very descriptive terms. Oh, love is being willing to sacrifice yourself for somebody else and, helping people when they need help and being forgiving when somebody does something bad to you, and so on and so forth. And all of these things describe loving actions, but none of them will tell you if you haven't experienced love inside. They're not going to tell you what love feels like, right? Explaining what love does is not explaining the fullness of what love is, right?
yeah,
And so that's basically the Orthodox perspective on theology is if you can approach all of these things, dogmatic questions and so on, from that external perspective where you are describing, the scripture says this, and logically that entails that, and the council pronounced this, and the canons typically get applied in this way. But if you don't experience the source of it that flows into all these other areas, then you are missing a key aspect, a key perspective on what all these things really are and why they really are. And so a theologian in the Orthodox Church is pretty much by definition a mystic, and probably best embodied in Simeon, who's called the New Theologian, who lived in, I think, the 10th century in the Eastern Empire. And if you read Simeon, the New Theologian, he is just purely a mystic. Like everything he talks about is prayer and how he was lifted up into heaven and saw the uncreated light and just it received all these enlightenments in terms of personal mystical experience. And that's the important thing. He came down from the mountain with the tablets, as it were, but none of that would have meant anything if he didn't have the aura, as it were, if he hadn't seen God.
yeah, and that's the framework of the Ojibwe tradition too. When I think about it, like when you were saying like to bring it back, so the whole concept of a theologian doesn't exist in the Ojibwe tradition,
Sure.
like we think of it. But what I was thinking of is that when you go out on a fast, so like people would say a vision quest. Usually, we never
Hmm.
called it that, but I use that word just to say what I mean
Yeah.
by a fast. So we go out for
Yeah.
4 days and 4 nights by ourselves in the bush, sometimes without a tent or anything. So I've done that, like just sit on a rock for four
Hmm.
days and 4 nights with no food or water. And the whole point of it, though, is to bring something back for the community. So
Yeah.
you're going out and sacrificing and practicing to bring back a vision, but the vision isn't. The idea is not that like a selfish, egoic, I'm going to go out there and become super awesome and have all these visions. I mean, sometimes that's obviously humans, right? But the intention behind it is to go out, and you're told this explicitly, to sacrifice for the people, to serve the people, and that whatever vision you get is to bring back for the people. Just like Moses coming down off
Yeah.
the mountain with the tablets, he didn't go up there for 40 days and 40 nights for himself. He came back with a law for the people who were
Hmm.
lost. Now we could have had a better law, and all that, but the framework is still there, and I think that's a better way to think of tradition. That like so like the other thing I was going to say about the way Ojibwe tradition changes. There's I used to be a firekeeper at the powwows. I was a head firekeeper at one of the local powwows here for a while, and so they have all these different dances that some of them are enacting animal movements and different healings and stuff like that. And they're all traditional and they're handed down, and they have very specific regalia that goes with them, the way you build your outfit and their feathers that are on, and all of it's like
Yeah.
highly ritualized, highly codified, but only in an oral way. And so it could vary from community to community, from
Yeah,
person
yeah.
to person, even though it's highly codified. And also, you can have a dream that changes everything. So, like, one of the most common dances you see at the powwow now is a jingle dress, and it's a women's dance, and it's a very simple dance, and they're covered in bells on this whole
Yeah.
dress, covered in bells, and it's this beautiful thing. And you would think it feels like, oh, it's this ancient dance, but actually, a grandma had a vision of it in the '80s or something like that,
Wow.
and just said the spirits want us to do this dance to heal the people, and it took off, and now it's
Yeah.
tradition, right?
Well,
And
of
I think
course,
that
those
that's
of
how
us who,
tradition it always is, whether we admit it or not, and we should just start admitting it. And then that allows
yes.
people to have their experiences and to shape their tradition and to move forward with what the
Yeah.
spirits or our subconscious or whatever you want to say wants us to do or leads us to do.
Yeah, tradition's very innovative in that way. One of the things, as I mentioned, I do a lot of study of early Christianity and try to keep up with like the academic literature on that. And one of the things that emerges the more you study it is just how weird ancient Christianity was and how much it's changed over the years. The Orthodox like to pretend that they've just always been doing the same thing for the last 2,000 years continuously, and that's completely bullshit. Like there's almost not a single thing that they do today that wasn't done radically differently or in a radically more heterogeneous way at some past point in time. And I think in many ways that's kind of a weakness of the Orthodox tradition is the failure to acknowledge that there are these radical updates to tradition. Like the liturgy that you sing every Sunday in the Orthodox Church is the liturgy of John Chrysostom. And John Chrysostom didn't live until the fourth century. And so there's 350 plus years of Christianity before this liturgy even comes into existence, much less becomes popularized, much less becomes the normal way that you celebrate in the church. Um, and so there are these same kinds of radical updates that occur every now and again. And one of the unfortunate aspects of the Orthodox tradition, or any tradition that really hones in a lot on dogmatism, is you tend to calcify these things until it becomes sort of an empty repetition of just what you've been handed down, and you no longer well, you know what? It almost is sort of that anti-theological idea of like you're just going through the external motions of the thing, and you no longer understand why these things are in the first place, why they came to be the way they are, how they could change in the future, whether they should change in the future. This all gets just very much sublimated in we're just going to keep repeating the same thing.
Yeah. So as much as I could just talk like this forever, I'm noticing the time, and so I thought
Yeah,
I'd bring us back to start to wrap up. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add before we do or anything like that,
I,
but
I think we've covered quite a lot.
yeah, we covered a lot of ground for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's been a great chat. I've enjoyed it, and yeah, maybe we'll do it again sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm definitely not a one-trick pony. I'm happy to follow up on anything that we've talked about today or examine some other topic from some other perspective another
Yeah, let's
time.
do it. Let's shoot some messages back and forth. We'll figure out a time.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you so much, my friend, and thanks everybody for watching us ramble. And we'll see y'all later.
Appreciate you.